I knew the HOA was bad news the moment I moved in, but I never expected them to try something this bold. It all started when I got a letter stuffed into my mailbox. No postage, no official seal, just a flimsy piece of paper with bold red letters at the top. Notice of outstanding fees, immediate payment required. I frowned at it, flipping through the pages. According to this so-called notice, my property had been accumulating hidden fees for years. Years? The grand total? Over $12,000. I actually laughed. Out loud. Right there in my front yard. There was no way this was real. I own my house outright. No mortgage, no liens, and certainly no ridiculous HOA fees. When I bought this place, I'd made sure that my property was not part of the HOA. I was just outside their jurisdiction, and I had the paperwork to prove it. So why did they think they could extort me like this? I didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning, as I was dragging my garbage cans to the curb, I saw her marching up my driveway. Veronica Orton, the HOA president. She was in her usual uniform, a pastel blazer, a clipboard clutched in one manicured hand, and an expression that made it clear she thought she owned the entire neighborhood. "Travis," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "I assume you got the notice?" I crossed my arms. "Yeah, I got your little ransom note. Pretty bold of you to try this scam." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "There's nothing scam-like about it. The HOA has recently reviewed property boundaries, and it turns out a portion of your land falls under our jurisdiction. That means you've been benefiting from our maintenance and security without paying your fair share." I stared at her. "Veronica, my property is not part of the HOA. It never has been." She gave me a condescending smile. "It is now." I felt my patience snap. "That's not how property law works, and you know it." She sighed dramatically, flipping through her clipboard. "Look, Travis, I don't make the rules. The board has determined that your property adjustments require back payments. You can fight it, but I strongly suggest you don't. You wouldn't want to accrue penalties, would you?" That was it. I'd had enough. "All right, Veronica," I said, my voice calm. "Since you're so confident in your little scheme, let's make this official. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." She arched an eyebrow. "A lawyer? Travis, you're making this much harder than it needs to be." I leaned in just enough to watch her confidence flicker. "You just tried to pull a $12,000 scam on the wrong person. Because you seem to have forgotten something very important." Her smug expression faltered. "Oh," I grinned. "My dad writes state tax laws. And guess what? He helped draft the laws on HOA jurisdiction." Veronica went pale. For the first time since I met her, she had nothing to say. Veronica stood there, gripping her clipboard tighter, her knuckles slightly whitening. She had clearly expected me to roll over and accept whatever nonsense the HOA was trying to pull. What she hadn't expected was for me to have an actual legal ace up my sleeve. She inhaled sharply, forcing a stiff smile back onto her face. "Travis, there's no need to escalate things unnecessarily. The HOA is simply enforcing what we believe to be a fair adjustment. Surely you understand that neighborhoods evolve and boundaries can shift." I cut her off with a dry chuckle. "Boundaries don't just shift because you want them to. Property lines are legally recorded. I have my deed, my plat survey, and my title, all of which state in black and white that my land is not under your authority. And unless you've got a court order proving otherwise, you're trespassing on my property, making fraudulent demands." Her jaw tightened, a flicker of frustration flashing across her face. "There's no need for hostility. I'm simply here to resolve this matter amicably." "Amicably?" I repeated, tilting my head. "You illegally stuffed a fake invoice in my mailbox and expected me to blindly hand over $12,000. That's not amicable, Veronica. That's extortion." Her mask of politeness cracked just enough for me to see the irritation beneath. She shifted on her heels, glancing at the houses around us. A few of my neighbors had taken notice of our conversation, peeking curiously from porches and driveways. She must have realized this wasn't the place for a full confrontation because she quickly smoothed down the front of her blazer and forced another smile. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation at the next HOA meeting," she said, her tone suddenly more measured. "You're welcome to attend and present your concerns. We're always open to discussion." I crossed my arms, watching her closely. "Oh, I'll be there. And I'm bringing all my documentation with me. I suggest you do the same because if you can't back up your claim with legal proof, this little stunt you're pulling could land you in serious trouble." For the first time, Veronica looked genuinely uneasy. She gave me a curt nod, muttered something about looking forward to the meeting, and turned on her heel, walking briskly back down my driveway. The moment she left, I went inside and grabbed my files. I wasn't just bluffing when I said I had documentation. My father had always drilled it into me to keep meticulous records, especially when it came to property ownership. I had everything: the original deed, boundary maps, tax documents, and even a written statement from the previous owner confirming that this house had never been under HOA governance. I spent the next few hours preparing, making copies of every relevant document. I also made a few calls, one to my dad, just to give him a heads up about the situation, and another to a real estate attorney I knew from work. He confirmed what I already suspected. The HOA had no legal grounds to charge me anything. If they tried to enforce their bogus fees, they'd be opening themselves up to a serious lawsuit. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around a few days later, I was ready. I arrived early, taking a seat near the front. The meeting was held in the neighborhood clubhouse, a building I had never stepped foot in, since I wasn't part of their little kingdom. The room was filled with residents, most of whom greeted each other in that forced, overly polite way that only existed in HOA-controlled neighborhoods. Veronica spotted me and immediately stiffened. She was seated at the head of a long table alongside a handful of other board members, all of whom gave me wary glances. Clearly, word had spread that I wasn't here to be intimidated. The meeting started with the usual HOA nonsense: discussions about lawn maintenance, complaints about trash cans being left out too long, and a heated argument over whether backyard fences should be uniform in color. I waited patiently, letting them go through their motions. Then Veronica cleared her throat and turned her attention to me. "We have one final matter to discuss this evening," she announced, her voice carrying an air of authority. "As many of you know, the HOA recently conducted a property boundary reassessment. As a result, we discovered that a portion of Mr. Travis's property falls within HOA jurisdiction, which means he has outstanding dues that need to be addressed." I could see some of the residents glancing at each other, murmuring quietly. A few of them looked sympathetic, but others nodded along as if Veronica's words were gospel. I leaned forward, placing my neatly organized stack of documents on the table. "Before we go any further, I'd like to see the legal basis for this claim. You're asserting that my property is under your control. So where's the official documentation proving that?" Veronica's expression didn't waver, but I caught the slight twitch in her fingers as she flipped through her notes. "The reassessment was conducted by the board, and That's not how property law works," I interrupted smoothly. "An HOA can't just decide to annex a property on their own. That requires legal filings, approval from the county, and consent from the homeowner. I have records going back 20 years proving my property has never been part of this HOA. So unless you have an official, legally binding document stating otherwise, you are making fraudulent claims." A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Some of them were clearly realizing that this wasn't as straightforward as Veronica had made it seem. One of the board members, a man in his 60s with a permanent frown, cleared his throat. "Mr. Travis, we're simply following what we believe to be fair." "What you believe doesn't change legal reality," I cut in. "And let's talk about fairness. You tried to hit me with a $12,000 invoice for fees I don't owe. That's not fairness, that's an attempt to extort money through intimidation." Veronica's mouth pressed into a thin line. "If you refuse to comply, we will be forced to take further action." I arched an eyebrow. "Further action? You mean like illegally trying to place a lien on my property? Because if you attempt that, I'll take this straight to court. And I guarantee you the judge will not look kindly on your little reassessment scheme." A few gasps rippled through the room. The word court had a way of making people pay attention. Veronica's composure was slipping. "There's no need for legal threats." "It's not a threat," I said calmly. "It's a promise. You have no authority over my property. You have no legal backing for your claims. And if you continue this harassment, I will press charges for fraud and attempted extortion." Silence filled the room. One of the board members whispered something to Veronica, who gave me a tight-lipped glare before forcing a strained smile. "Perhaps we should revisit this matter after further discussion." "No need," I said, gathering my papers. "I'll be sending a formal cease and desist letter first thing tomorrow. If I hear one more word about bogus fees, I'll see you in court." And with that, I stood up and walked out, leaving the entire HOA board scrambling. The next morning, I wasted no time drafting the cease and desist letter. My attorney helped fine-tune the wording to ensure it was airtight. I had it printed on official letterhead, notarized, and hand-delivered it to the HOA's office. There was no way they could pretend they didn't receive it. With that handled, I went about my day, hoping that Veronica and her cronies would finally back off. But deep down, I knew better. People like her didn't just give up when their schemes fell apart. They doubled down. And sure enough, the retaliation came swiftly. That evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something unusual. A bright orange sticker plastered across my front door. My stomach tightened as I stepped out of my truck and ripped it off. Notice of non-compliance, immediate action required. I scanned the paper. According to the HOA, my front yard was in violation of community standards due to unapproved lawn decor, excessive weeds, and improper trash disposal. I laughed under my breath. It was almost impressive how blatant they were. My yard was pristine. I kept my grass trimmed, my flower beds neat, and my trash bins were always put away on time. This wasn't about violations. It was about revenge. I wasn't about to play along. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of my yard from every angle, making sure to capture the perfectly manicured lawn, the empty driveway, and the neatly stacked garbage bins tucked beside the house. Then I took a deep breath and walked inside, already planning my next move. The next day, I filed an official complaint with the County Code Enforcement Office. Since my property wasn't actually under the HOA's jurisdiction, their bogus citations had no legal basis. If they wanted to claim I was violating some non-existent rule, they'd have to explain that to the county inspectors. By the time I got home, I had another surprise waiting for me. A tow truck was idling at the end of my driveway and a uniformed driver was standing near my truck, clipboard in hand. My stomach dropped as I jogged over. "Something I can help you with?" The driver looked up, slightly startled. Yeah. I got a request to tow this vehicle for unauthorized street parking." I stared at him. "My truck is parked in my own driveway." He glanced at the paper in his hand, clearly realizing something wasn't right. "Look, man, I'm just going off the request. Some HOA rep called this in." I clenched my jaw. Veronica was really playing dirty now. I pulled out my phone and snapped pictures of my truck, making sure to capture the fact that it was legally parked. Then I turned back to the driver. "Yeah, that request was fraudulent. My property isn't under the HOA, which means they have zero authority to call for a tow. If you try to take my truck, you'll be committing theft." The driver hesitated, then sighed. "I don't want any trouble. If this is bogus, I'm not touching it." He climbed back into his truck, muttering about wasted time as he drove off. I stood there, fists clenched, watching him leave. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore. Veronica was escalating. That night, I decided it was time to hit back harder. I spent the next several hours researching HOA abuse cases in my state. Turns out, there had been multiple lawsuits against HOAs trying to annex properties illegally. Some had even resulted in significant fines and legal consequences for the board members involved. I compiled every relevant case, printed out the most damning ones, and attached them to a formal letter addressed to the HOA board. In it, I outlined their repeated harassment, the fraudulent fees, the fake violation notices, and the attempted vehicle tow. I made it clear that if they didn't immediately cease their actions, I would not only sue them but also report them to the state attorney general for fraudulent activity. The next morning, I sent the letter via certified mail. Then I waited. For 2 days, nothing happened. No more notices, no more bogus citations. I thought maybe, just maybe, they had finally realized they were out of their depth. But then, on the 3rd day, I woke up to something that made my blood boil. A bright yellow sign planted right on the edge of my lawn. Upcoming HOA hearing property annexation proposal. I ripped it out of the ground and marched straight to the HOA office. The receptionist barely had time to greet me before I stormed past her and pushed open the door to Veronica's office. She looked up from her desk, clearly startled at my sudden entrance. "You've got some nerve," I said, throwing the sign onto her desk. She composed herself quickly, folding her hands neatly. "Travis, there's no need for theatrics. The board has decided to formally vote on annexing your property into the HOA. It's a legitimate process." I laughed, disbelief washing over me. "A legitimate process? You can't just vote my property into your HOA. That's not how this works." She leaned back in her chair, giving me a sickeningly sweet smile. You might be surprised. If the majority of the board agrees, we can petition the county for an official reassessment. Once that happens, your property would be legally included. It's all perfectly within our rights. I clenched my fists, barely keeping my temper in check. You really think you can pull this off? Her smile didn't waver. I think you underestimate how much influence the HOA has. And frankly, Travis, you've been quite the nuisance. Maybe it's time you started playing by the rules. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. You just made a huge mistake. Her confidence faltered just for a moment. Excuse me. I leaned forward, resting my hands on her desk. You just admitted, in front of a witness, I gestured toward the receptionist still hovering nervously in the doorway, that this is retaliation. That's called bad faith, Veronica. And if you try to push this through, I will bury you in legal filings so deep you'll be drowning in paperwork for years. For the first time, real uncertainty flickered in her eyes. I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned and walked out, already dialing my attorney. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As soon as I stepped out of the HOA office, I called my attorney. He picked up on the second ring, and I wasted no time laying everything out: the bogus annexation vote, Veronica's thinly veiled threats, and the fact that she had openly admitted to retaliation in front of a witness. He listened carefully, then told me exactly what I wanted to hear. They had no legal standing. If the HOA wanted to annex my property, they needed my consent. Without it, they could try petitioning the county all they wanted, but they would hit a legal brick wall. Even if they somehow got a hearing, the paper trail: I had my deed, my title, my property tax records, would shut down their scheme before it even started. Hearing that was reassuring, but I wasn't about to sit back and wait for them to try something else. I needed to make this as public as possible. That evening, I compiled everything: the fraudulent charges, the illegal notices, the attempted towing, and now their absurd attempt at forced annexation, into a detailed report. Then I posted it in the neighborhood's online forum, where I knew every resident, including the HOA board, would see it. I kept it factual, attached my legal documents, and made it crystal clear that the HOA was operating far outside the law. The reaction was immediate. Comments flooded in, most from homeowners who had long suspected the board was corrupt but didn't have proof. A few residents even shared their own horror stories: bogus fines, sudden rule changes, and aggressive threats for noncompliance. It became painfully obvious that I wasn't the first person they had tried to intimidate. Then something unexpected happened. A former board member messaged me privately. He had resigned a year earlier after clashing with Veronica, and he was more than happy to spill everything. According to him, the HOA had been running a quiet little racket for years, falsifying violations, strong-arming homeowners into unnecessary fees, and even using HOA funds for personal expenses. He had tried to bring it to light, but the rest of the board, eager to keep their power, had shut him out. This was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I met him at a local diner, and he handed me a stack of documents. Meeting minutes, internal emails, financial reports, evidence that the HOA had been operating under a veil of corruption for years. I wasted no time. By noon, I had forwarded everything to my attorney, who nearly laughed at the sheer volume of violations. The HOA wasn't just breaking rules, they were potentially facing serious legal consequences. Misappropriation of funds, fraudulent billing, and now an attempt to forcibly annex private property? This wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. That afternoon, I sent Veronica and the entire board a formal legal notice. It outlined every violation, every illegal action, and made it clear that if they didn't immediately cease all harassment and attempts to manipulate property boundaries, I would be pursuing full legal action. I didn't have to wait long for a response. That evening, Veronica showed up at my house. This time, she wasn't alone. Two of her board members stood behind her, their expressions grim. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. "You've made a serious mistake," she said, her voice stiff. I leaned against my doorframe, arms crossed. "No, Veronica, you did." One of the board members, a tall man with a receding hairline, stepped forward, his tone more measured. "Look, Travis, this is getting out of hand. We can find a way to resolve this without things getting ugly." I let out a short laugh. "Ugly? You tried to steal my land. You fabricated fines. You sent a tow truck to take my truck. And now you're trying to act like I'm the problem." Veronica's face darkened. "This isn't going to end well for you." I held up my phone, tapping the screen. "You're being recorded, by the way, so if you want to keep making threats, be my guest." For the first time, genuine panic flashed across her face. She turned to her board members, but neither of them spoke. They had clearly realized this was spiraling out of control. After a long silence, one of them muttered, "Maybe we should just drop this." Veronica spun on him, eyes blazing. "Drop it? Do you have any idea how this makes us look?" I chuckled. "Like criminals?" Her jaw clenched, but she knew she had lost. Without another word, she turned and stalked off, her board members trailing behind her. 2 days later, the HOA vote for annexing my property was quietly canceled. A week after that, Veronica resigned as president. By the end of the month, the entire board had been replaced. And just like that, the HOA's reign of terror came to an end. With Veronica gone and the HOA board replaced, I thought things would finally settle down. The new leadership seemed more reasonable, and for the first time in years, homeowners weren't living under a constant cloud of fear. But I should have known better. A few weeks after the dust settled, I got a letter in the mail. This one was different from the fraud-riddled notices Veronica had sent. It was official, stamped with the county assessor's seal. I tore it open and scanned the contents. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The letter stated that my property had been reassessed and was now subject to additional taxes due to community incorporation. In other words, someone had filed paperwork claiming my land was part of an official neighborhood district, one that, surprise, surprise, was managed by the HOA. I felt my pulse quicken. Veronica was gone, but her fingerprints were all over this. I went straight to the county office the next morning. The clerk at the records desk barely glanced at me as she pulled up my file. I leaned in, watching as she scrolled through the recent changes. Then I saw it. A document had been filed 2 months earlier, right before Veronica resigned. It requested a boundary expansion for the HOA, pushing its jurisdictional limits past its original markers. And somehow, despite my property's exemption, it had been approved. I kept my voice steady as I asked who had signed off on it. She clicked a few keys, then frowned. "That's strange. It looks like the approval came from a private surveyor's report, not a county official." I asked for a copy, and when she handed it over, I nearly laughed out loud. The surveyor's name was Richard Orton, Veronica's husband. The audacity was almost impressive. I thanked the clerk and walked out, gripping the papers tightly. Veronica might have been gone, but she had rigged the system before leaving. This wasn't over. That afternoon, I met with my attorney again. He studied the documents and let out a low exhale. "This is fraudulent as hell. They used a private surveyor to manipulate records, and the county processed it without verifying the legitimacy." I asked what my options were. "First, we file an appeal with the county. Second, we report this to the state licensing board. If Richard Orton falsified a land assessment, that's professional misconduct. He could lose his license over this." That was all I needed to hear. By the next day, the appeal was officially filed, and a complaint was submitted to the state board. But I wasn't about to sit around and wait for bureaucrats to sort this out. I went back to the neighborhood forum and posted everything. The fraudulent boundary expansion, the bogus tax adjustments, and the fact that Veronica had orchestrated it through her husband before stepping down. This time, the outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Homeowners who had once been on the fence about the HOA's corruption were now furious. Some even began digging through their own records, checking for discrepancies in their property assessments. And that's when the floodgates opened. 3 other homeowners found similar irregularities. Minor boundary changes here, unexplained tax hikes there. It wasn't just me. Veronica had been pulling the scam on multiple properties, slowly expanding the HOA's reach without consent. The new HOA board, to their credit, wanted nothing to do with it. They called an emergency meeting and publicly condemned Veronica's actions. But condemning wasn't enough. I wanted a full reversal. 2 weeks later, the county finally responded to my appeal. They had reviewed the documents and found the boundary expansion to be improperly filed. In other words, it was junk. My property was officially restored to its original, HOA-free status. But the real victory came when the state board completed its investigation. Richard Orton's license was revoked. He had not only falsified the survey but had done so without proper county authorization. When confronted, he tried to claim it was a clerical error, but the evidence was too damning. He lost his credentials, and with them, any remaining power his wife had tried to wield from the shadows. The final nail in the coffin came when a group of homeowners filed a civil suit against the HOA for damages related to fraudulent fees and boundary changes. It wasn't long before the HOA, desperate to avoid a full legal battle, settled out of court. With that, the last remnants of Veronica's influence crumbled. The community finally had a clean slate, and I kept my land, my freedom, and a newfound reputation as the guy no HOA would ever dare mess with again. With the fraudulent boundary expansion reversed and Richard Orton's license revoked, I thought I could finally put this entire ordeal behind me. The HOA had been gutted, Veronica was disgraced, and the new board wanted nothing more than to rebuild trust. But there was one last piece of unfinished business that I couldn't ignore: the damages. While I had avoided paying a dime to the corrupt HOA, not everyone had been so lucky. Several homeowners had been forced to hand over thousands in bogus fees. Some had their credit damaged by fraudulent liens, and others had been harassed into costly renovations they never should have had to make. The settlement from the civil suit had helped, but it didn't cover everything. And I wasn't about to let Veronica and Richard Orton walk away without facing real consequences. I met with my attorney again, this time to explore criminal charges. HOA corruption was one thing, but orchestrating a fraudulent boundary expansion and manipulating tax assessments? That was something else entirely. My attorney laid it out for me: if I wanted to push this further, I needed to take it to the district attorney's office. So I did. I gathered every piece of evidence, every fraudulent notice, and every manipulated document. I compiled testimonies from homeowners who had been scammed, and I presented it all in a formal complaint to the DA. The response was swift. Within 2 weeks, an official investigation was underway. And then the real fireworks started. One evening, I was working in my garage when I heard raised voices outside. I stepped out and saw 2 sheriff's deputies knocking on the Ortons' front door. Veronica answered, her expression shifting from irritation to barely restrained panic as they started asking questions. I couldn't hear much, but I didn't need to. A week later, the news broke. Richard Orton was being formally charged with fraud and falsification of legal documents. Veronica, while not directly charged, was under investigation for her role in the scheme. The county had determined that the fraudulent survey resulted in unlawful financial gains for the HOA, and since she had been president at the time, she wasn't off the hook yet. The fallout was immediate. Veronica and Richard disappeared from the neighborhood practically overnight. Their house, once the pristine centerpiece of the HOA's iron rule, sat dark and empty. Rumors swirled about whether they had sold it or simply abandoned it, but no one really cared. The neighborhood was too busy celebrating their downfall. With the Ortons gone, the new HOA board moved quickly to clean house. Every fraudulent fine was officially reversed, credit disputes were assisted by legal professionals, and the bylaws were rewritten to ensure no future board could ever pull the same stunt. For the first time since moving in, I felt like the neighborhood was finally free. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, my neighbor, an older man named Gary, walked over and handed me a cold beer. "You did good, kid," he said, settling into the chair beside me. I took a sip, letting the weight of the last few months finally settle. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Gary chuckled. "Well, you sure made sure of that. The way I see it, you didn't just take them down, you gave this place a fresh start." I looked around. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No one was afraid to park their car in the wrong spot. No one was worried about surprise fines. The fear that had hung over everyone like a storm cloud was gone. And as I watched kids playing in the yards, neighbors chatting freely, and a community finally reclaiming its home, I knew Gary was right. It wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure no one ever had to fight this battle again.